A Hollywood legend walked into a struggling Detroit church only to be ignored by the pastor. What began as rejection soon spiraled into a battle between pride and compassion, faith and fame. But when the truth finally came out, the congregation witnessed a moment so shocking it would change their lives forever. Before we continue this incredible story, let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel, because tomorrow we have another inspiring story you won't want to miss. The church sat at the corner of a weary Detroit block, its red brick walls cracked from years of harsh winters and harder times. A faded sign above the door read, "New Hope Baptist Church," but the neighborhood knew it was barely hanging on. Pastor Elijah Carter stood inside the sanctuary, staring at rows of half-empty pews. He had been fighting for years to keep the lights on, often dipping into his own paycheck from a part-time security job just to cover heating bills. Every Sunday, he prayed that new faces would walk through the doors, but every Sunday, the numbers shrank. The once booming choir now struggled to muster more than a handful of voices. Paint peeled from the ceiling, and water stains darkened the corners where rain had found its way inside. Carter's sermons were fiery, but he carried the weight of a shepherd guarding a flock that was slowly disappearing. That particular morning, as the choir sang, the sanctuary door creaked open. A tall man in a plain black jacket slipped in quietly, lowering his head as if not wanting to disturb anyone. He took a seat near the back, choosing a shadowed pew where he could listen without being noticed. Some members turned to glance at him, but no one recognized the stranger. He looked like just another wanderer, perhaps curious, perhaps lost. Pastor Carter noticed too, his eyes narrowing slightly as he adjusted his notes. In a city where outsiders came and went with promises that rarely lasted, Carter had learned to guard his heart. His church was not a place for tourists. He wanted people who would stay, not those who appeared once and vanished. The man sat still, listening intently as the pastor spoke about perseverance in seasons of drought. He leaned forward, his eyes fixed on Carter, absorbing every word. The congregation of maybe 50 scattered souls murmured their amens, weary but loyal. When Carter's sermon ended, the visitor remained seated for a long moment, hands clasped, head bowed in thought. As the final hymn faded, he rose to leave. That's when Pastor Carter stepped from the pulpit and intercepted him near the aisle. "First time here?" Carter asked, his voice cordial but edged with caution. "Yes," the man answered softly, his voice calm and steady. "It's a beautiful service." Carter studied him. The stranger's face was familiar somehow, though out of place in the faded sanctuary. His clothes were simple, nothing flashy, but there was a quiet gravity about him. Something in Carter bristled. He had seen too many people come with smooth words, offering to help, only to vanish when things got hard. He nodded stiffly. "Well, we're a small church. Folks around here are family. Not everyone fits." The words stung more than Carter realized. The stranger smiled faintly, as though he had expected as much. "I understand," he said. "Thank you for letting me sit in." He turned to leave. Carter watched him go, telling himself he had done the right thing by keeping his guard. But in the back of the church, a few members whispered. They thought they had recognized the man, though they couldn't quite believe it. Keanu Reeves stepped outside into the cool Detroit air, pulling his jacket tighter against the breeze. He had come to the church anonymously, without entourage, without cameras. For years he had lived in the glare of Hollywood. But what he hungered for now wasn't applause. It was quiet. It was honesty. He had slipped into the church because he longed to see how faith survived in places where struggle was real, not polished for red carpets or stage lights. Yet the brief conversation with Pastor Carter lingered in his mind, sharp as a splinter. Not everyone fits. He didn't resent the pastor. If anything, he understood. He had walked through enough dark valleys in his own life losses, griefs, moments where trust had been broken to know why a man would build walls. Still, he felt the sting of being dismissed. His instinct was to disappear, to respect the boundaries. But something about the weary faces in the congregation haunted him. Children fidgeting with tattered hymnals, mothers holding tired infants, older men staring into space as though their hope had already slipped away. He had seen those same eyes on movie sets when crew members worked endless hours for little recognition. He had seen them in hospitals when visiting loved ones. They were the eyes of people who carried heavy burdens with no one to help them lift the weight. Back inside, Pastor Carter lingered near the pulpit, pretending to organize his notes. He knew he had been abrupt. Something about the stranger unsettled him. His appearance was too sharp, his presence too steady, his manner too calm for just a passerby. But Carter's memories of smooth-talking visitors who promised a fun program still burned. One man had once pledged thousands to repair the roof, only to vanish after taking credit in the local newspaper. Another had promised scholarships, then backed out when the spotlight dimmed. Carter had learned that hope could wound as deeply as disappointment. Better to guard his flock than risk betrayal again. Meanwhile, Keanu walked the block around the church slowly. The neighborhood bore scars of decades of decline. Boarded windows, empty storefronts, children riding rusted bikes on cracked sidewalks. And yet, scattered between the ruins, were signs of resilience. A woman tended a small garden in a front yard, coaxing life out of stubborn soil. Two boys chased each other with laughter, ignoring the sagging houses around them. A man swept the steps of his shop, though the door hadn't opened to customers in months. Life was still here. It only needed encouragement, resources, and someone willing to believe in it. He stopped at the corner and looked back at the church. He could walk away. No one would know he had ever been here. His anonymity would remain intact. But something pulled at him, a conviction that this place and the people inside mattered more than whether he was welcomed or not. He had been brushed off, yes, but he had also seen what most of the world overlooked: a congregation on the edge of collapse, yet still singing, a pastor weary but still preaching, a seed of hope buried under concrete, and maybe, just maybe, it was a seed worth watering. Pastor Carter locked the side door of the church and walked to his car, still thinking about the stranger. He couldn't shake the feeling that he had misjudged him. There had been no arrogance in the man's eyes, no swagger, no demand to be noticed. Instead, there was quiet respect, the kind that almost made Carter feel guilty for his words. But guilt quickly gave way to caution. He had seen too much disappointment to lower his guard now. A shepherd's job was to protect the flock, and sometimes that meant keeping wolves out, even wolves dressed like saints. Yet later that night, sitting at his kitchen table, Carter replayed the image of the man listening so intently during the sermon. He had leaned forward. As though the words mattered. Few people did that anymore. Most checked their watches or their phones, waiting for the service to end. This stranger had listened. Carter rubbed his temples and sighed. Maybe he had been too hard. Maybe he had mistaken sincerity for intrusion. Across the city, Keanu sat alone in a modest hotel room, the Bible from the nightstand open in front of him. He wasn't a man who flaunted religion, but he carried respect for faith. His own life had been shaped by loss and hardship, and though Hollywood saw him as untouchable, he often felt like a wanderer searching for anchor points. That's what had drawn him into the church that morning. He hadn't come to be a savior. He had come to listen, to learn, to be reminded of what mattered when the cameras faded. But he had been reminded of something else, too: how easy it was to be dismissed when you didn't fit someone's expectations. The sting of rejection wasn't new. He had lived through it in his career, in relationships, in life. But what troubled him wasn't the bruise to his ego. It was what the rejection revealed. If the pastor treated an unknown visitor with suspicion, how often did others feel that same cold shoulder? How many lost souls had walked into that sanctuary searching for belonging, only to leave feeling unseen? Keanu closed the book and stared at the ceiling. He could let it go. He could leave Detroit the next morning, fly back to Los Angeles, return to scripts and sets and the safe rhythms of his work. No one would ever know. But he couldn't quiet the image of the children he had seen fidgeting in the pews, their shoes scuffed, their faces carrying more years than their age should allow. Something in him whispered that walking away would be easier, but staying might matter more. Pastor Carter, lying awake in his own bed, wrestled with a similar unease. He had turned away many outsiders before, but this time felt different. He couldn't explain why. All he knew was that the man in the back pew hadn't come for recognition. He had come for something deeper. And Carter, despite himself, felt the first stirrings of regret. Neither man slept much that night. Both carried questions they couldn't yet answer. And both would discover soon enough that this uneasy first encounter was only the beginning of a story far larger than either of them imagined. The next Sunday morning, Keanu returned. He slipped into the same back pew, dressed as simply as before. No one in the congregation had yet spoken his name aloud, but a few eyes lingered on him longer than they had the week before. He sang along softly with the hymns, his voice low, almost reverent. Pastor Elijah Carter noticed again from the pulpit. This time he felt more unsettled than suspicious. Why would a man like that come back after being brushed aside? After the service ended, Keanu waited until most of the congregation had filed out. He approached Carter slowly, giving him time to prepare. The pastor stiffened, clutching his worn Bible a little tighter. Keanu extended his hand. "Pastor Carter, thank you for the sermon today. Your words about endurance reminded me of something I've learned. Sometimes, it's not about winning battles, but about not giving up the fight." Carter hesitated before shaking his hand. "I'm glad you found something useful," he said carefully. Keanu studied his face, choosing his words with care. "I don't want to intrude, but I noticed the children last week. They remind me of kids I've met around the world, bright, curious, but without enough chances. If you ever wanted, I'd be honored to help support a program for them. Reading groups, maybe computers, anything that gives them more opportunities." The words were gentle, sincere. Keanu wasn't boasting, only offering. But Carter's jaw tightened. He heard the tone of someone who meant well, but didn't understand the cost of misplaced trust. "Mr. Reeves," Carter said finally, using the name he now recognized, "I appreciate your offer. But we're not looking for charity projects here. These kids don't need another celebrity making promises. They need stability, consistency, someone who won't disappear when the cameras turn off." Keanu's face softened. "I understand why you'd think that, but I'm not here for cameras. No one even knows I'm here." "That's today," Carter replied. "But tomorrow, someone will. And then it becomes about your image, not their lives. I can't let this church become anyone's backdrop." The words were firm, almost cold. Keanu nodded, absorbing them. He had expected skepticism, but the blunt refusal still cut deep. He could argue. He could insist on his sincerity, but he didn't. Instead, he said quietly, "I respect your decision, Pastor." Carter turned away, already convincing himself he had done the right thing. Yet as Keanu walked out the door again, something inside Carter twisted with unease. He had rejected help before, but this time felt different. Keanu stepped into the sunlight, the echo of the refusal heavy in his chest. He could leave Detroit behind, but the tug inside him only grew stronger. That evening, Pastor Carter sat at his kitchen table again, the same spot where he often reviewed his notes and prayed over unpaid bills. His wife, Denise, noticed his silence. She placed a hand on his shoulder. "Elijah, you've been somewhere else all night. What's on your mind?" He hesitated. That man came back. Keanu Reeves. Denise's eyebrows lifted. She had watched him from the pews too, but she hadn't said anything. "He seems different. Not like the others who've wandered in." "Different doesn't mean trustworthy," Carter muttered. He tapped his Bible with his finger. "This church has been burned before. Men with big wallets and bigger egos come in, offer the world, then leave when it gets complicated. I can't let our people be used like that again." Denise studied him for a moment. "And what if you're wrong this time?" Her words hung in the air, heavy. Carter looked away. He didn't like entertaining that possibility. Across town, Keanu sat in his hotel room again, staring out at the Detroit skyline. He replayed the pastor's words in his head. We're not looking for charity projects. He understood the suspicion. Hollywood's reputation was built on glittering illusions. He had spent decades distancing himself from that image, choosing quiet generosity over headlines. But even in anonymity, he couldn't escape the assumptions. He thought of his sister, Kim, and the nights he had sat by her bedside during her illness, quietly giving without wanting anything in return. He thought of the crew members on his films, people he treated to dinners or helped with medical bills, never asking for thanks. Giving, for him, had always been about respect, about human dignity. And yet here, in a crumbling Detroit church, his sincerity had been mistaken for vanity. The question gnawed at him. Should he press harder or step back? Part of him longed to respect the pastor's decision, to let it go. But the memory of those children, restless, wide-eyed, hungry for something beyond their neighborhood, wouldn't leave him. He saw himself in their searching eyes. He knew what it felt like to long for a chance that never seemed to come. Meanwhile, in the quiet streets near the church, members of the congregation gathered on porches and in small kitchens. They whispered about the man who had appeared 2 Sundays in a row. Some swore it was really him, the movie star. Others dismissed it as wishful thinking. But all agreed on one thing. The way he looked at the children during service wasn't the way tourists looked. It was the way someone who cared looked. Back at the church office, Carter opened a drawer and pulled out an old folder filled with letters of broken promises. He leafed through them one by one, pledges to fund scholarships, repair roofs, sponsor food drives, each one ending in disappointment. He closed the folder with a sigh. No matter how sincere that stranger seemed, he could not risk adding one more letter to that pile. Monday morning came gray and cold. Keanu walked the streets near the church, his hands deep in his jacket pockets. He wasn't sure why he was still in Detroit. Work back in Los Angeles waited, yet something about this place refused to let him go. He stopped by a corner store where a small group of children gathered before school. Their backpacks were worn, straps fraying, but their laughter was sharp and unbroken. One boy held a library book with missing pages, flipping through it as if trying to piece together the story. Keanu's chest tightened. These were the kids he had seen sitting restlessly in the pews. They weren't statistics or projects. They were lives, teetering on the edge of possibility. That evening, Keanu returned to the church office quietly, hoping for a second chance to speak with Pastor Carter. The pastor was alone, sorting through papers under the dim light of his desk lamp. Carter looked up, surprised but not pleased. "You again," Carter said, his tone firm. "I thought we were clear." "I know," Keanu answered. His voice was steady, respectful. "I don't want to push. I couldn't leave without saying this. I'm not here to make this church my backdrop. I'm here because I believe the children deserve more than what the world has handed them." Carter leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. "Belief is easy. Commitment is harder. When the bills pile up, when the cameras disappear, will you still be here?" Keanu held his gaze. "I can't promise I'll always be in Detroit. My life takes me places. But I can promise this. I won't give to be seen. I'll give because I know what it's like to lose, to struggle, and to wish someone believed in me." For a brief second, Carter's defenses wavered. He heard something genuine in those words, something that reminded him of his own battles. But he forced himself to stay guarded. "Mr. Reeves, we're not a charity case. We're a church. We stand because God sustains us, not because of Hollywood gifts. Thank you for your offer, but we'll carry on our own." Keanu nodded slowly, disappointment settling heavy in his chest. He stood, placing his hand gently on the desk, not in anger, but in respect. "Then, I'll step back. But Pastor, if you ever change your mind, even just for the children, you'll know where to find me." He left the office quietly, the sound of his footsteps fading into the empty hallway. Pastor Carter sat still, staring at the closed door, feeling a strange conflict inside. He had protected his flock again, yet instead of relief, he felt the ache of something lost. Outside, Keanu paused under the streetlight. his breath clouding in the night air. He had been refused again, but the tug inside him only grew stronger. Something told him this wasn't the end of the story. The following Sunday, Keanu returned once again. He didn't sit in the shadows this time. He chose a spot along the middle pews, where he could join the hymns and bow his head with the rest of the congregation. No introduction, no fanfare, just quiet presence. People whispered, but he ignored them, focusing instead on the words being sung. After the service, when families drifted toward the fellowship hall for coffee and biscuits, he didn't leave. He rolled up his sleeves and helped fold chairs. He wiped down tables without being asked, moving with a simple ease that surprised the older women bustling about. By the third week, some of the regulars began speaking to him. Mrs. Jenkins, an elderly woman who always wore a wide-brimmed hat, leaned on her cane and said, "You remind me of my grandson, always helping with the little things nobody wants to do." Keanu smiled warmly and replied, "That's the work that matters most." Children warmed to him even faster. He played with them in the churchyard, chasing them in simple games, lifting heavy boxes of hymnals so they wouldn't strain themselves. They didn't care about his face on posters or movies. They cared that he listened when they spoke, that he tied a shoelace without fuss, that he laughed at their jokes. Pastor Carter, however, kept his distance. He watched from the pulpit or from his office window, suspicious of this persistence. Most visitors came once or twice, not week after week, and no one who had been turned away twice came back smiling. To Carter, it felt like a test. He had seen charisma sway people before, and he feared the church would be charmed into dependence. Still, he couldn't ignore the way the congregation softened around this stranger. They lingered longer after service. They smiled more. Even the choir's singing grew louder, as if lifted by an energy they hadn't felt in years. Then came the announcement that shook everyone. One Wednesday night, after prayer meeting, Carter told the group gathered in the fellowship hall that the city had cut their funding for the youth program. The community center they rented down the block, where children came after school for tutoring and safe activities, was months behind on payments. Without intervention, the landlord would close it by the end of the month. The room fell silent. Mothers bowed their heads, worried about where their children would go. Fathers clenched their jaws, angry but helpless. The church itself barely had enough to keep its own lights on. There was no extra to save the program. Keanu sat quietly at the edge of the room, listening. He said nothing, but his heart sank as he saw the fear ripple through the families. He knew what the center meant. It wasn't just a building, it was hope. It was safety in a neighborhood where streets could swallow children whole if they had nowhere else to go. That night, Keanu made a decision. He didn't ask permission. He didn't wait for approval. He went to the landlord directly and paid the overdue rent in full, adding enough for several more months. He asked for one condition only, that his name never be mentioned. By the following Sunday, a strange buzz moved through the pews. Parents whispered relief. Children grinned with excitement. The community center was safe. Word had spread that the landlord had been paid in full, and no one quite knew how. Some speculated that a city grant had come through. Others thought an anonymous donor had stepped in. Whatever the reason, the program was alive. Pastor Carter stood at the pulpit, heart conflicted. He hadn't slept well since the landlord called him personally to confirm the news. "Your rent is covered for the next 6 months, the man said. Carter had asked who had paid, but the landlord only chuckled, the kind who doesn't want credit. At first, Carter thought it was a trick, but as the days passed and receipts arrived, the truth became unavoidable. Someone with resources had intervened. He looked out at the congregation and his eyes landed on Keanu. The man sat quietly, hands folded, head slightly bowed, as though he carried no knowledge of the miracle that had occurred. Carter's jaw tightened. He felt a storm of gratitude and suspicion colliding inside him. Gratitude because the children were safe. Suspicion because his instincts screamed that the man he had tried to push away was behind it. After service, Carter lingered until the sanctuary emptied. He found Keanu stacking hymnals neatly in the back. "Mr. Reeves," Carter began, his voice measured, "I need to ask you something." Keanu looked up, his expression calm. "Of course. The landlord called me, said the youth center's rent is paid. All of it. Was that you? For a moment, silence filled the space between them. Keanu didn't look away. He gave a small nod. Yes, I asked him not to tell anyone. Carter's throat tightened. He wanted to feel relief, but pride bristled instead. Why would you do that after I told you no? I said we didn't need charity. Keanu's answer was simple. Because it wasn't about charity. It was about the children. I didn't want them to lose their place. I didn't do it to change your church. I did it so they'd have somewhere safe. The words struck deeper than Carter expected. He searched for anger, but found only honesty in the man's voice. Still, the conflict inside him burned. He thought of the promises broken in the past, the humiliations of being used as someone else's good deed. He feared the same pattern repeating. You went behind my back, Carter said quietly. Even if your motives were good, you made me look like a man who can't lead his own flock. Keanu lowered his gaze. That was never my intention. If you want, you can tell them it was anyone else. The truth doesn't need my name on it. All that matters is that the doors stay open. Carter's hands tightened. Around the edge of the pew, he couldn't deny the impact, but neither could he let go of his pride. That night, Pastor Carter sat in his office long after the church was empty. The glow from a single desk lamp cast shadows across the wooden floor. On his desk lay 2 stacks of papers. One, the budget ledgers showing months of red ink. The other, reports of the youth program that had kept children off the streets. Without Keanu's intervention, the second stack would have been meaningless. Pages documenting something that no longer existed. Now those pages represented hope restored. He leaned back in his chair, torn between gratitude and unease. Pride whispered that he had been undermined, that allowing this kind of help would weaken his authority. Humility whispered louder that sometimes God sent answers in unexpected forms, and maybe rejecting them was as much a sin as pride itself. He closed his eyes, remembering the faces of the children when he had broken the news of the funding cut. Could he really let his personal discomfort outweigh their future? Meanwhile, across town, Keanu walked alone under the dim glow of streetlights. He thought about his choice to step in quietly. It had never been about recognition. It was about seeing need and acting before hesitation could talk him out of it. Yet he also knew his actions had placed Pastor Carter in a difficult position. He respected the man too much to ignore that reality. Keanu's life had taught him that leadership carried weight, and sometimes even a gift could feel like a challenge. The following Wednesday, Carter stood before his congregation during Bible study. He held the microphone loosely, speaking slower than usual. You all know by now that the youth center is safe. The rent has been paid. Murmurs of thanks and relief filled the room. Carter paused, his gaze sweeping across the faces of mothers, fathers, and children who had feared losing the one place they trusted. He swallowed hard. I know many of you are wondering who made this possible. All I can say is that someone cared enough to give without asking for thanks. Applause broke out, some lifting their hands in praise. Carter felt both peace and conflict stir inside him. He hadn't revealed the name, but he knew the truth. And so, he suspected, did more than a few others. Eyes shifted toward the quiet man in the back, who lowered his head humbly, pretending not to notice. Afterward, Denise touched her husband's arm as they walked to the car. You know as well as I do who kept those doors open, she said gently. The question is, why are you fighting it so hard? Carter didn't answer right away. He stared at the church illuminated by the streetlight, its old bricks tired but still standing. Finally, he said, because if I let him in, I have to admit I can't do this alone. Denise's reply was soft but piercing. Maybe that's the point. For the first time, Carter allowed himself to wonder if rejecting help wasn't protecting his church at all, but holding it back. The following week, Pastor Elijah Carter called a quiet meeting in his office. Denise sat beside him, her hand resting lightly on his arm, while 2 deacons filled the chairs opposite. Keanu had been invited, though Carter's tone on the phone had been careful, almost reluctant. When Keanu stepped inside, he carried the same calm presence as always, dressed plainly, his eyes attentive but humble. Carter cleared his throat, I don't make decisions like this lightly, but our children need more than just a roof over their heads. They need guidance, structure, something that shows them their future is bigger than these blocks." He paused, almost unwilling to finish the thought. Denise gave him a small nod. Carter exhaled. "I'm willing to try a pilot program. Something small. Tutoring sessions for the kids after school. Reading, homework help, maybe basic skills, nothing flashy, and no headlines." Keanu leaned forward slightly. "That sounds perfect. How can I help?" Carter bristled. He had expected negotiation, conditions, some hidden agenda. Instead, the response was so simple, it disarmed him. "You can provide the materials," Carter said slowly. "Books, supplies, maybe a few computers if that's possible. But it has to stay quiet. No announcements. No attention." "Done," Keanu replied, without hesitation. "I'll take care of it." The deacons exchanged wary looks. They had seen outsiders promise things before, but there was something different in the way Keanu spoke. He didn't oversell. He didn't embellish. He simply agreed. A week later, boxes arrived at the community center, stacks of children's books, workbooks for math and reading, notebooks, pencils, even 3 modest laptops. The parents who volunteered to unpack them were stunned. The kids, wide-eyed, flipped through the colorful pages as though they had stumbled into treasure. But what surprised everyone most wasn't the supplies. It was the man who walked in that afternoon, carrying pizza boxes under his arms. Keanu. He set the food on the table, then lowered himself onto the floor where a group of children sat with their new books. "Who wants to read first?" he asked with a smile. The children crowded around, one little girl climbing onto his lap without hesitation. Parents watched from the doorway, frozen in disbelief. Hollywood stars didn't sit cross-legged on the floor with neighborhood kids. They didn't point to words on a page, sounding them out with patience. They didn't laugh when a boy stumbled over a sentence, gently encouraging him to try again. Carter stood at the back of the room, his arms folded. He wanted to stay suspicious, to remind himself this could still be a performance. But as he watched Keanu lean close to help a shy boy whisper through his first full paragraph, something inside him shifted. This didn't look like performance. It looked like service. The pilot tutoring program grew quickly. Word spread through the neighborhood, not because of flyers or promotions, but because children went home talking excitedly about what they had read, what they had learned, and who had been sitting with them. Parents, at first hesitant, began dropping in to watch. They expected a celebrity putting on a show. What they found instead was a man blending into the background, wearing jeans and an old sweatshirt, listening more than speaking. On Tuesday evening, Keanu sat with a boy named Marcus, who struggled with basic multiplication. The boy grew frustrated, tossing down his pencil. "I'm just dumb," he muttered, his voice cracking. Keanu gently picked up the pencil and placed it back in Marcus's hand. "You're not dumb. You're learning. Everyone struggles at first. I struggled too." Marcus blinked up at him. "You? But you're famous." Keanu smiled softly. "Fame doesn't make math easier. Hard work does. And you've got that in you." The boy tried again, and when he got the problem right, the grin that spread across his face was worth more than applause in any theater. Parents saw these moments and whispered to each other. Some admitted they had been wrong about him. Others said nothing, but their watchful eyes softened with each passing day. Even the most skeptical began to feel something new, trust. Pastor Carter, however, wrestled with a storm inside. Each night he visited the center, expecting to catch a glimpse of hidden pride, some clue that would prove his doubts justified. But all he saw was Keanu kneeling beside children, reading storybooks, teaching them to sound out tricky words. He brought snacks, stayed late to sweep the floors, even fixed a broken chair with his own hands. One Thursday, Carter lingered by the doorway as Keanu read Charlotte's Web aloud to a circle of kids. The children were transfixed, hanging on every word. When Keanu closed the book, one girl clapped and shouted, "Read another one!" The room erupted in laughter. Carter felt a lump form in his throat. That night at home, Denise asked him plainly, "What more do you need to see?" Carter shook his head slowly. "I don't know. Part of me is waiting for the other shoe to drop. But another part sees a man who may be here for reasons I can't explain." Denise squeezed his hand. Maybe the explanation is simple. Maybe he's here because he cares. For the first time in years, Carter didn't have a ready answer. The next Saturday, the community center buzzed with unusual energy. Parents had been invited to sit in on the tutoring session, partly to reassure them, partly to celebrate the small successes the children were already making. Folding chairs lined the back wall, filled with mothers, fathers, and grandparents. The children gathered in front, eager to show off what they had learned. Keanu knelt on the floor beside a boy named Isaiah, who clutched a picture book nervously. The boy stammered through the first few lines, then faltered, glancing toward the crowd. His mother sat with her hands clasped tightly, fear in her eyes that her son would freeze. Keanu leaned close and whispered, "Take your time. You've got this. I'll read with you if you want." Together, they read line by line, Keanu softly guiding him through each stumble. By the time Isaiah reached the last page, his voice had grown stronger. When he closed the book, the room filled with applause. His mother's eyes brimmed with tears, and she mouthed, "Thank you." Isaiah smiled wider than anyone had ever seen. Carter watched from the corner, his heart caught in a tug of war. He saw the relief on that mother's face, the pride glowing in Isaiah's eyes, and he knew this was real. No camera crew had been invited. No spotlight shone on Keanu. This was service stripped of recognition, pure and unadorned. After the session, families lingered. Children tugged at Keanu's sleeves, asking if he'd be back next week. He promised he would. Parents approached quietly, offering handshakes, some even hugs. They weren't thanking a movie star. They were thanking a man who had sat on the floor with their children and believed in them when no one else did. Later that night, Carter sat alone in the sanctuary. The stained glass glowed faintly under the city lights. He bowed his head, wrestling with his thoughts. For so long, he had equated outside help with weakness, with the risk of exploitation. But what he had witnessed wasn't exploitation. It was healing. It was possibility. It was hope breathing into lives that had nearly forgotten how to dream. Denise joined him, sitting quietly in the pew beside him. "Elijah," she said softly, "what you saw today, wasn't that the kind of miracle you've been praying for?" Carter swallowed hard. "It feels like one. But it scares me too." "Why?" "Because if I admit he's genuine, I have to admit I've been wrong." Denise touched his hand. Sometimes, the hardest step of faith is admitting God sends answers in forms we don't expect. Carter closed his eyes. For the first time, he let himself consider that maybe, just maybe, Keanu Reeves hadn't come for fame, recognition, or glory. Maybe he had come for the children, and maybe that was enough. Within weeks, the tutoring program outgrew its small beginnings. At first, a dozen children came after school, their laughter filling the modest community center. By the end of the month, there were 30. Soon after, nearly 50. Parents from surrounding neighborhoods began asking if their children could join, word spreading faster than Carter had anticipated. The old fellowship hall that once stood half empty was now alive every evening with voices reciting spelling words, pencils scratching across paper, and shy readers discovering confidence, one sentence at a time. The congregation had never seen such energy. Families who hadn't set foot inside the church for years began returning on Sundays, drawn by the program's reputation. The sanctuary filled with new faces, rows that had once been patchy, now crowded with hopeful parents and children. What had begun as a reluctant experiment was now breathing life back into the entire church. But with the growth came challenges. Supplies vanished quickly, space grew tight, and volunteers struggled to manage the numbers. Carter found himself caught between gratitude and unease. He saw lives being touched, but he also felt the strain of something spiraling beyond his control. The turning point came one Friday afternoon when a local reporter appeared at the community center. Camera crew in tow, she explained she was doing a feature on grassroots efforts in Detroit. She asked a few questions about the program, filmed the children reading, and smiled as parents praised the changes they saw in their kids. Carter, wary of attention, tried to keep the details vague. But then the children, excited, pointed to the tall man kneeling with them on the floor. "That's Mr. Keanu," one girl shouted, her voice carrying across the room. The reporter blinked, startled. "Did you say Keanu Reeves?" Before Carter could intervene, the name stuck. The next day, the local newspaper ran a front-page article. "Hollywood star helps save Detroit Church's youth program." Pictures showed Keanu surrounded by children, sitting cross-legged on the floor, smiling as he held open a book. By Sunday, the church was overwhelmed. Strangers crowded the sanctuary, phones raised, hoping to catch a glimpse of the actor. Donations poured in from people who had never attended before, but so did curiosity seekers who cared more about snapping a photo than supporting the mission. Carter's chest tightened as he stood at the pulpit, preaching to a congregation that felt more like an audience. After service, he found Keanu standing quietly by the doorway, politely greeting strangers who recognized him. Carter pulled him aside, his voice low but heavy with frustration. "This isn't what I wanted. I wanted children to be helped, not a circus of cameras and gawkers." Keanu met his gaze steadily. "I didn't call them. I didn't want this either. But we can't control how people respond when they see hope." Carter exhaled, torn between relief and anger. Growth had brought blessings, but also burdens. The following week was unlike anything Pastor Carter had ever experienced. Cars lined the streets outside the church, filling every available space. Reporters appeared without warning, hoping for quotes. A television crew requested interviews. Even the mayor's office called, asking if Carter would be willing to discuss partnerships. Inside the fellowship hall, the program swelled to nearly 70 children. The sound was joyful but chaotic. Volunteers were stretched thin. Parents offered to help but weren't sure how, and Carter found himself pacing the hall with an anxious knot in his stomach. He had prayed for growth, but not like this. Not growth that threatened to pull the church into a spotlight it was never meant to bear. That evening, after the last child had been picked up, Carter sat heavily on one of the folding chairs. His shoulders slumped. The old fear returned, the fear that his church was becoming a stage for someone else's story. He rubbed his forehead, wishing he could turn back the clock to the quiet days when only 30 faithful members filled the sanctuary. Keanu approached slowly, carrying a trash bag filled with discarded paper cups and snack wrappers. He set it down and sat beside Carter. "You look tired," he said gently. Carter gave a dry laugh. "Tired doesn't begin to cover it. This church wasn't built for cameras. I never wanted fame. I wanted faithfulness." Keanu nodded, his voice quiet. "I know, and that's why I respect you." Carter turned to him, eyes narrowing. "Respect? You've brought a storm to my doorstep. Reporters, crowds, even politicians. They don't see our work. They see your name." Keanu absorbed the words without flinching. His reply was calm, steady. "Elijah, this is still your church. I'm just here to help. I don't need the spotlight. I don't want it. If you tell me to disappear, I will. But I believe in what's happening here, and I can't ignore that." Carter studied him, torn. He expected defensiveness, excuses, maybe even a lecture. But instead, Keanu's humility pressed against the wall of pride he had built for so long. "What if this all gets out of hand?" Carter asked, his voice breaking slightly. "What if the attention ruins everything we've worked for?" Keanu's gaze was firm. "Then we remind them why we're here. Not for headlines, not for me, for the children. As long as that stays the center, the rest will pass." Carter let the words sink in. For the first time, he felt a flicker of peace, but the struggle inside him was far from over. He knew that accepting Keanu's help meant walking a path filled with scrutiny. And yet, looking at the man beside him, tired, grounded, and sincere, he wondered if maybe this storm could lead to something greater than he dared imagine. The following Sunday morning, the sanctuary overflowed. People stood in the back. When the pews filled, news cameras lined the street outside, hoping to capture the surge of families entering the modest brick church. Pastor Carter stood at the pulpit, his sermon notes trembling in his hands. He looked out at the sea of faces, some familiar, many not, and felt the weight pressing on him. He began his message haltingly, speaking about humility and the dangers of pride. But as he looked at the children sitting in the front rows, the same children who now eagerly ran to tutoring sessions every week, his words shifted. He spoke instead about service, about the calling to care for one another, about remembering that faith was not about numbers or fame, but about lives transformed one at a time. The congregation listened in silence, the clamor of cameras outside, muffled by the old wooden walls. For a brief moment, Carter felt something return, the sense that God was still here, even in the chaos, even in the spotlight. After service, the crowd spilled into the fellowship hall. Reporters tried to push in, but volunteers held the doors shut. Children ran to Keanu, tugging at his sleeves, begging him to read another story. Parents gathered in small circles, marveling at the changes in their kids. Carter stood apart, his chest heavy with both pride and fear. Denise joined him quietly. "Look at them," she whispered. "Isn't this what you prayed for?" He shook his head slowly. "I prayed for growth of spirit, not of spectacle." She touched his arm. Maybe the two came together because that's what this community needed. Just then, Keanu approached, kneeling down to tie a boy's loose shoelace. He smiled, whispered encouragement, then rose and walked over to Carter. His voice was calm, steady. "Elijah, I know this isn't easy. The attention will fade. But the children, their lives are changing right now. That's what matters." Carter studied him, searching for any trace of arrogance. He found none. Only sincerity, only quiet, resolve. He realized in that moment that the conflict wasn't between Keanu and himself. It was between his own fear of losing control and his desire to see his people thrive. He let out a long breath. "This is still God's church," Carter said softly. Keanu nodded. "It always will be. I'm just here to help, however you'll let me." For the first time, Carter extended his hand, not out of formality, but acceptance. Keanu took it firmly. The two men stood in silence as children's laughter filled the hall around them. For now, that was enough. It started with a phone call from the mayor's office. Pastor Elijah Carter had barely finished breakfast when the invitation arrived. A citywide press conference highlighting programs that had revitalized Detroit communities. Carter's tutoring ministry was at the top of the list. He hesitated, holding the receiver in silence, until Denise urged him to accept. "This is bigger than us, Elijah. Maybe it's time people know." 2 days later, Carter stood behind a polished podium in City Hall. Cameras clicked in rapid bursts, microphones angled toward his face. Officials introduced him as a local hero whose leadership had transformed young lives. He adjusted his glasses, heart pounding, and began to speak. He told the story of children who had once been written off, but now read confidently. He spoke of families who had found new hope through something as simple as after-school tutoring. His voice wavered when he described Isaiah, the boy who once called himself dumb, but now read to his mother with pride. The room fell silent, reporters scribbling, cameras rolling. By the end, applause filled the chamber. The headlines the next morning were louder than he ever imagined. Detroit pastor leads movement of hope. National networks picked up the story. Calls flooded the church office, congressional staffers asking about partnerships, philanthropic foundations offering funding, corporations pledging support. The calls, congregation buzzed with energy. Some were elated. "Pastor, this is God's favor," one deacon exclaimed. "With this kind of money, we could open centers across the city, maybe across the country." Others were uneasy. A longtime member pulled Carter aside after service, whispering, "We're a family, not a franchise. If we grow too big, we'll lose who we are." Carter carried both voices with him everywhere he went. In meetings, he heard the lure of expansion. New buildings, more programs, broader influence. In prayer, he heard the whisper of caution. Intimacy lost, relationships strained, a church swallowed by its own success. Keanu noticed the change. He had grown quieter, staying in the background during services, declining interviews, gently avoiding the spotlight. One evening, after the tutoring session ended, he found Carter alone in the sanctuary. The pastor sat slumped on the front pew, phone buzzing with unanswered messages. "You look like a man being pulled in 2 directions," Keanu said softly. Carter chuckled bitterly. "Try 10 directions. Everyone wants me to say yes, to bigger, to faster, to more. But what if saying yes means losing the heart of it all?" Keanu sat beside him. "Then don't answer to them. Answer to your conscience. Answer to the one who called you here. This is your church, Elijah. I'll help however you need. But I won't make this choice for you." The words hung heavy in the quiet sanctuary. For the first time, Carter realized the real test wasn't success or failure. It was whether he had the courage to remain faithful in the midst of success. The days that followed were unlike anything Pastor Carter had ever known. Letters poured in from Washington, offering federal grants for faith-based initiatives. Wealthy donors called from across the country, some pledging 6 figures if the church would expand its tutoring program nationwide. One business executive flew in from New York, promising to underwrite a state-of-the-art community center if Carter agreed to let his company's name be engraved on the building. The offers dazzled some members of the congregation. Deacon Harris, usually cautious, stood during a Sunday meeting and declared, "This is our moment. We've prayed for revival, and now God is giving us the means. Why should we limit ourselves to this one neighborhood when there are children across America who need what we have?" But others bristled. Sister Elaine, a grandmother who had been part of the church for 40 years, rose to her feet with fire in her voice. "We built this house with sweat and sacrifice. We held it together when the roof leaked and the pews were empty. Now outsiders want to make us a brand. I say no. I say we stay who we are." The room erupted in debate. Younger members leaned toward growth, imagining opportunities. Older ones clung to the intimacy they had guarded for decades. Carter stood at the center, his silence speaking louder than their arguments. He felt torn in half. Every argument rang true, yet every path carried a cost. Later that week, Carter met with city officials who spoke excitedly about scaling the program. Charts, projections, and timelines covered the conference table. "You could lead a national model," one official urged. "Detroit would be the birthplace of a movement." Carter listened politely, nodding, but inside his chest throbbed with unease. That night, he walked the empty church halls, long after everyone had gone home. He stopped in the fellowship hall where the children's books lay stacked, the smell of crayons and chalk lingering in the air. He pictured Isaiah's smile, Marcus's determination, the laughter that filled these walls. Wasn't this enough? Wasn't this exactly what they were called to do, love their neighbors here, in this place, without the noise of cameras and the lure of headlines? Keanu found him standing there, lost in thought. "The offers keep coming," Carter murmured. "It feels like a flood. I can't stop." Keanu folded his hands. "Then let the flood pass. Not every opportunity is meant to be seized. The world will always offer you more. But sometimes more is the enemy of what matters most." Carter met his eyes, searching. "And what matters most?" Keanu's reply was steady, almost like a vow. "The children in front of you. The families you already serve. If expansion helps them, good. But if it pulls you away from them, it's not worth the price." Carter's heart trembled. Deep down, he knew Keanu was right. The question was whether he had the courage to act on it. On Sunday evening, Carter called a special congregational meeting. The sanctuary filled quickly, the air tense with expectation. Rumors had already spread. Some believed he would announce a partnership with the government. Others feared he would shut everything down. Families sat shoulder to shoulder, old members beside newcomers, everyone waiting for direction. Carter stepped to the front, his Bible in hand, his heart pounding. He looked across the faces, children fidgeting, parents watching closely, elders sitting stiff with folded arms. He cleared his throat. "Brothers and sisters, we are standing at a crossroads. Doors have opened in ways I never imagined. Opportunities for money, for partnerships, for expansion. Many see this as a blessing, and perhaps it island. But blessings can also become burdens if they lead us away from our calling. The room was silent, every word sinking deep. Carter continued, his voice growing stronger. "We are not here to build an empire. We are here to serve, to love the children in our neighborhood, to give them a safe place, a chance to grow. That mission is sacred. And if anything threatens to turn this into a show, into a business, into something that feeds our pride more than our people, then we must have the courage to say no." A murmur rippled through the congregation. Some nodded with relief, others frowned, already mourning the opportunities slipping away. Carter raised his hand. "I know not everyone will agree. Some of you will want bigger, faster, louder, but I cannot lead this church toward fame at the cost of faithfulness. We will continue our tutoring program. We will accept help where it aligns with our values, but we will not sell our soul for recognition." At that moment, Keanu, seated quietly in the back, rose to his feet. He didn't move forward, didn't ask for attention, but his voice carried clearly. "This is why I came, not to change your mission, but to serve it. I will stand with whatever choice you make, because this church belongs to you, not me." The words settled over the room like a calming wind. The tension eased, if only slightly. Some still longed for expansion. Others clung to the simplicity of what had begun. But all could see the unity between their pastor and the man who had brought unexpected light into their community. After the meeting, Carter walked outside into the cool night air. Keanu joined him, hands tucked in his jacket pockets. Carter exhaled deeply. "I don't know if I made the right choice tonight, but I made the only one I could live with." Keanu gave a small smile. Then it was the right choice. They stood in silence, watching children chase each other on the church lawn under the glow of streetlights. In that moment, Carter felt peace return, not because the path ahead was clear, but because he knew he had chosen faith over fame. The letter arrived on official stationery, embossed with the seal of the United States. Pastor Elijah Carter read it once, then again, hardly believing the words. The Department of Education was inviting him to Washington, D.C. to discuss leading a new federal initiative on community development. It wasn't just an advisory role. The offer suggested he could head the entire program, one that would oversee funding for thousands of churches and nonprofits across the country. The weight of the invitation pressed on him. He sat in his office long after the children had gone home, staring at the letter. Washington meant influence. Washington meant the chance to scale what had begun in their small fellowship hall to a national level. The thought stirred something inside him, a mix of pride and fear. Could this be the next step God was calling him to take? Or was it a temptation disguised as opportunity? That evening, he laid the letter on the kitchen table where Denise was preparing dinner. She read it carefully, her brow furrowing. "They want you to move to Washington?" "That's what it says," Carter replied. "They're offering resources beyond anything we've dreamed of. Imagine programs like ours in every struggling neighborhood in America." Denise set the letter down and looked at him steadily. "Elijah, that's a lot of power. But power comes with cost. What about this church? What about these children? Can you serve them from an office in Washington?" Her words cut to the heart of his unease. He wanted to answer yes, to believe that broader influence could multiply the good. But as he thought of Isaiah sounding out words for his mother, of Marcus finally mastering his multiplication tables, he felt the tension sharpen. These were not numbers on a report. These were lives, faces, children who needed presence more than policy. Still, the lure was strong. The idea of helping millions whispered to him in quiet moments. At night, he dreamed of podiums, press conferences, sweeping reforms. The nation, calling his name. He hated how much it appealed to him. He was cross-legged on the floor, a circle of kids leaning in close as he helped them assemble a puzzle of the United States. They laughed when he mispronounced a city name, teased him when he took too long to fit a piece, and clapped when the picture finally came together. Carter lingered in the doorway, unnoticed. He saw the light in the children's eyes, the way they leaned toward Keanu not because he was famous, but because he was present. It struck him like a blow. Leadership wasn't about how many you could reach from a podium. It was about how deeply you could reach the ones in front of you. And yet, the letter still waited on his desk, daring him to choose. That night, Carter lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The letter from Washington sat on the nightstand like a beacon, glowing in the darkness. Denise shifted beside him, then turned to face him. She had been waiting for him to speak. "You're not sleeping," she said softly. "How can I? This offer, it could change everything. Think of the reach, the resources. We've always prayed for more, and now it's in my hands." Denise placed her hand on his chest. "Elijah, I've watched you for years. I've seen you carry this church when it felt like no one cared. I've seen you scrape by, fixing leaks, preaching to half-empty pews, working 3 jobs just to keep the lights on. And now, yes, you finally have recognition. But ask yourself this: what did you dream of in those darkest nights? Did you dream of DC offices and headlines? Or did you dream of a neighborhood redeemed?" He closed his eyes. Her words sank like stones. "I dreamed of children safe in their own streets," he whispered. "I dreamed of parents with hope. I dreamed of this community alive again." "Then don't let the shine of Washington blind you," Denise said firmly. "Power can look like opportunity, but it can also be a trap. The calling hasn't changed. You told me once that God planted us here for a reason. Do you believe that reason has expired?" Carter felt a lump rise in his throat. He wanted to protest, to argue that national influence could multiply the good. But deep inside, he knew she was right. The heart of his mission was not in marble halls, but in cracked sidewalks and crowded classrooms right outside their church doors. The next morning, he returned to the fellowship hall. The children greeted him with wide smiles. Isaiah rushed forward, holding a book. "Pastor, listen, I can read the whole thing now." He launched into the story with pride, stumbling only once before finishing with a grin. Carter applauded, his chest swelling with something Washington could never give him. Across the room, Keanu was on his knees, helping 2 girls practice writing their names. He didn't look up when Carter entered. He was too focused on encouraging their shaky letters, praising every attempt. Carter stood in silence, watching. Here was a man who could have been anywhere in the world, yet he chose to kneel on a dusty floor with children who needed him. Later, when the children left, Carter approached Keanu. "Why do you keep coming back?" he asked. Keanu smiled faintly. "Because they remind me of what really matters. I could be on a set, traveling, doing 1,000 other things. But this feels real. Every time one of them believes in themselves, it's like watching a miracle." Carter's eyes stung. For the first time, the pull of Washington felt weaker. The following week, Carter boarded a train to Washington for the scheduled meeting. He told no one except Denise. She urged him to go, not to accept, but to see for himself what was truly being offered. The train ride was long and restless, his reflection in the window reminding him of a man caught between 2 worlds. At the Capitol, polished shoes clicked across marble floors, and aides greeted him with firm handshakes. In the conference room, charts and projections covered the walls. Officials spoke of nationwide impact, of billions in funding, of Carter's name becoming synonymous with reform. Their words dazzled, filling his ears with promises of scale and influence. For a moment, he imagined his work multiplied across thousands of cities, his name in history books. But then his mind wandered to Isaiah's proud grin, to Marcus's steady progress, to the sound of Keanu's gentle encouragement. He remembered Denise's voice, reminding him that their calling had never been about power. His chest tightened. The room around him blurred. An official leaned forward. "Pastor Carter, are you ready to lead this movement?" Carter looked at the papers, at the seal of authority stamped on every document. Then he shook his head slowly. "I'm grateful for the honor, but my place is not here. My place is with the children and families in Detroit. That's where I belong." Silence filled the room. Some looked stunned, others frustrated. "You're turning down the chance to help millions?" one asked incredulously. "I'm choosing to help the ones I've been given," Carter replied. If I lose that, I lose everything. He left the building with his shoulders lighter. The burden of indecision finally lifted. The train ride home felt different. The city lights faded, replaced by the familiar streets of Detroit. When he stepped off at the station, Denise was waiting. He walked straight to her and pulled her into his arms. I chose us. I chose this community. That evening, he went to the fellowship hall where Keanu was once again surrounded by children. Carter watched for a moment, then joined in, kneeling beside them as they worked through homework. Keanu glanced up, reading the decision in his eyes. You stayed, he said quietly. I stayed, Carter confirmed. Because this is where God planted me, and no podium in Washington can compare to this. The children didn't understand the weight of his words, but they felt his presence. To them, their pastor wasn't a man who turned down power. He was the man who showed up when they needed him most. And for Carter, that was enough. Elijah Carter's decision to stay rippled through the congregation like a quiet but undeniable wave. It was not announced with fanfare or captured in headlines. It simply took root in the small choices of everyday people who began to believe that their community could grow stronger with the gifts already in their hands. The tutoring program, once the heart of the ministry, became a seedbed for other ideas. One afternoon, a teenager named Andre stayed behind after helping younger children with their reading. He tugged at Carter's sleeve nervously. Pastor, I know a little about computers. My uncle gave me some old parts. Maybe I could teach the kids how to use them? Carter blinked at him, surprised by the initiative. You want to teach? Andre nodded, his voice shaky but determined. I'm not great at math or reading, but I know computers. I think they'd listen to me. Within weeks, folding tables in the fellowship hall were covered with salvaged keyboards and monitors. Children gathered around Andre as he showed them how to type, how to open simple programs, how to play educational games. What began as a small idea quickly drew more kids, and soon the church's unused basement was transformed into a makeshift computer lab. Keanu visited often, but always stayed on the edges. He watched Andre lead, stepping in only when asked. He carried boxes, swept up wires, brought snacks for the kids, and left the teaching to the teenager who had discovered his own voice. One evening, as Carter passed by the basement, he paused to see Keanu leaning against the wall, smiling as Andre instructed a group of eager children. The sight stirred something deep within him. The famous actor wasn't there to impress or to dominate. He was there to lift others into the spotlight. Not long after, another idea blossomed. Mrs. Evelyn Thompson, a grandmother in her 70s, had been attending the tutoring program to watch her granddaughter. She often brought food, simple dishes of cornbread and stew that filled the hall with warmth. One evening, as parents lingered, she began sharing recipes and tips. You don't need much money to feed a family healthy meals, she said, showing young mothers how to stretch ingredients. Carter suggested she hold a class. At first, she laughed. Me? Teach a class? I've just been cooking all my life. But when the first Saturday came, 20 people showed up, eager to learn from her. Soon the church kitchen buzzed with laughter and the smell of simmering pots. Mrs. Thompson moved with confidence, instructing, encouraging, passing wooden spoons from hand to hand. She discovered a new purpose, and others discovered her hidden gift. These programs didn't arrive from government contracts or outside donors. They grew from the hearts of people who had once believed they had nothing to give. Slowly, the fellowship hall became a hive of activity children reading upstairs, teenagers tinkering with computers downstairs, parents learning to cook nutritious meals in the kitchen. Keanu remained steady in the background. When people tried to credit him, he redirected the praise. This is their work, he insisted. I'm just here to cheer them on. And the community, almost without realizing it, began to believe in itself again. The momentum could not be stopped. What had begun with tutoring and computer classes soon branched into new opportunities. One afternoon, Carter received a call from Deacon Harris, who had recently retired from his job at an auto plant. Pastor, Harris said, his voice filled with a mixture of pride and hesitation. I've been thinking. These young men need more than books. They need skills. I know welding, carpentry, and basic mechanics. If you let me, I could show them." Carter wasted no time. A week later, the church parking lot became a workshop. Harris brought in tools he had stored in his garage. He set up wooden tables, mounted vises, and spread out scrap metal. A group of teenagers gathered curiously, unsure at first. Harris picked up a hammer and demonstrated, his hands steady from decades of labor. Soon the boys followed, sparks flying, sweat on their brows, a sense of pride glowing in their eyes. Word spread quickly. Fathers who had once drifted from the church returned to offer their trades: plumbing, electrical work, even landscaping. What could have been a simple youth program transformed into a full-fledged job training initiative. These young men and women were not only learning but imagining futures that once felt impossible. Carter often watched from the sidelines, humbled. He realized he didn't have to orchestrate every detail. The congregation itself was blooming into leadership. And through it all, Keanu remained a quiet presence. He carried lumber, held tools, swept the floor when the day's work ended. Cameras would have loved the sight of a movie star hauling boards in a Detroit parking lot, but no cameras were invited. Keanu wanted no spotlight here, only the satisfaction of service. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the rooftops, Carter noticed Keanu lingering by the fence, observing Harris laugh with the boys. Carter walked over. "You could be on a set in Hollywood, yet here you are. Doesn't it ever feel too small?" Keanu shook his head. "Not small, real. Out there, applause comes and goes. But here, a boy learning to weld, a grandmother teaching mothers to cook those things last. Fame is fleeting. But this is legacy." Carter felt the words settle into his bones. Legacy. Not built by headlines, but by the quiet victories of ordinary people. The ripple effect continued. A young mother named Marisol approached Carter shyly after service. Her English was broken, but her determination was clear. "Pastor, I can sew. Clothes, curtains, anything. Maybe I teach?" Carter encouraged her, and soon another program began. The fellowship hall echoed with the hum of sewing machines borrowed from neighbors. Women gathered, learning to mend, to create, to save money for their families. Each week brought a new surprise. What had started as one man's vision and another man's humility was becoming a garden of miracles. The church was no longer just a sanctuary for worship. It was a living, breathing organism. Children reading upstairs, young men working with tools outside, mothers sewing in the hall, families sharing meals from Mrs. Thompson's kitchen. Everywhere Carter looked, ordinary people were discovering extraordinary power within themselves. And Keanu, always in the background, kept pointing the credit back to them, reminding everyone that the true miracle was already inside their own hands. It began with a phone call from Memphis. Pastor Leonard Williams had heard whispers about the Detroit church that had transformed its neighborhood without waiting on government handouts or wealthy donors. He wanted to see it for himself. Carter hesitated at first, unsure whether their fragile programs were ready for scrutiny. But Denise reminded him that blessings were meant to be shared, so he opened the doors. When Pastor Williams arrived, he didn't find polished facilities or sleek presentations. He found a fellowship hall alive with activity. Children bent over books, teenagers hunched at computer screens, women laughing in the kitchen as they traded recipes. Out back, the clang of tools rang out as Harris guided young men through carpentry basics. Pastor Williams stood in the middle of it all, wide-eyed. "This," he whispered, "is what my city needs." Other pastors soon followed. Some came from nearby towns, others from as far as Chicago and St. Louis. They didn't arrive in suits with notebooks. They came tired, desperate, worn from trying to hold together shrinking congregations in struggling neighborhoods. Carter welcomed them humbly, giving tours not of buildings, but of people. He introduced them to Andre, the teenager who ran the computer lab, and to Mrs. Thompson, who had turned her cooking into a ministry. He pointed to Marisol, whose sewing classes now produced uniforms for local children. "These are the leaders," Carter told the visitors. "Not me, them. That's the lesson. Raise up what God has already placed in your people." The pastors took notes, not on formulas, but on principles. Carter repeated them often. Dignity, presence, empowerment. Don't try to copy us. Don't import our programs. Look at your own neighborhoods. Ask who's already carrying gifts and give them the space to use them. Travel was costly, and some pastors could barely afford the bus ticket to Detroit. Keanu noticed and quietly covered expenses, slipping funds into envelopes, never attaching his name. When Carter found out, he thanked him, but Keanu shook his head. I'm just making sure they can get here. What they do when they go home, that's their miracle. The impact was immediate. Within months, word came back from Memphis that Pastor Williams had started a reading circle led by retired teachers in his congregation. In Chicago, a young pastor launched a job training workshop after being inspired by Harris's parking lot classes. In Gary, Indiana, a church basement was converted into a kitchen where mothers taught nutrition just like Mrs. Thompson. Carter listened to these reports with awe, realizing that something bigger than his own church was unfolding. What had begun as a desperate attempt to keep the doors open was becoming a model for renewal across cities that had long been written off. And through it all, Keanu never stepped forward for recognition. He kept sweeping floors, stacking chairs, and smiling quietly from the background as the movement began to spread beyond Detroit's borders. Carter could feel it in his bones. This was no longer just their story. It was becoming a story of hope for the nation. By the following spring, the trickle of visitors turned into a steady stream. Pastors arrived from Cleveland, Baltimore, and even as far as Dallas, each one eager to witness what Detroit had birthed. The fellowship hall became not only a classroom for children, but a training ground for leaders. Folding chairs filled quickly as Carter stood before groups of tired, hopeful pastors who carried the weight of their neighborhoods on their shoulders. He spoke plainly, without theatrics. What you see here isn't a miracle of money. It's a miracle of trust. We didn't import experts. We didn't wait for outside solutions. We believed that God had already planted what we needed in our own people. And then we gave them permission to lead. The visitors nodded, some scribbling in notebooks, others just soaking in the atmosphere. During breaks, Carter encouraged them to talk to the members themselves. Mrs. Thompson told them how she went from simply feeding her granddaughter to running a weekly cooking workshop. Andre proudly explained how he built computers from donated parts and taught kids basic coding. Harris shared how teaching young men carpentry gave him a renewed sense of purpose in retirement. These testimonies struck harder than any lecture. The pastors returned home not with Carter's blueprints, but with conviction. If Detroit could do it, so could they. In Chicago, Pastor Daniel Morales transformed his fellowship hall into a community workspace where out-of-work fathers repaired bicycles and donated them to children. In Memphis, Pastor Williams expanded his reading circles into tutoring hubs spread across 3 neighborhoods. In Pittsburgh, a small church started sewing classes after Marisol shared her story during a visit. Carter listened to updates that trickled back by phone calls and letters. He often sat in his office late at night, rereading their words, tears filling his eyes. What had once been a desperate attempt to save one congregation was now inspiring dozens. Through it all, Keanu kept his role hidden. He quietly funded gas money for pastors who couldn't afford the trip. He purchased used laptops for Andre's lab, never signing the donation slip. Whenever Carter tried to recognize him, he deflected. Don't point to me, point to them. They're the ones carrying this. But even without his name attached, people noticed his spirit. Visitors often whispered about the tall man stacking chairs, sweeping floors, or playing checkers with neighborhood kids. Few realized who he truly was. To them, he was simply another servant in the house, another pair of hands willing to work. One Sunday, after yet another wave of pastors departed, Denise leaned toward Carter as they cleaned up. You realize what's happening, don't you? Carter nodded slowly. It's spreading, not because of us, but because people are beginning to believe in what's already inside their communities. She smiled. That belief is contagious. The thought carried him through the weeks that followed. He knew fame would chase them again. He knew media would soon pick up the story. But what mattered most wasn't who got the credit. It was that seeds were being planted in cities across the country, each one bearing fruit in its own soil. The miracle wasn't just Detroit anymore. The miracle was multiplication. The headlines broke on a gray Monday morning. Bold letters screamed across television screens and newsstands. Hollywood star using churches as cover for secret empire. Beneath it, Keanu's name blazed in red ink. Tied to accusations of laundering money through Detroit's faith-based programs, Pastor Elijah Carter sat frozen in his office, the newspaper spread open across his desk. His phone buzzed non-stop calls from reporters, worried members of the congregation, even old friends asking if the rumors were true. Each ring felt like another crack splintering the fragile trust they had built. Denise rushed in with her own copy of the paper. "Elijah, they're running the story everywhere. It's on every channel. They're saying Keanu created these programs to polish his image, to dodge taxes, to play savior." He closed his eyes, the weight pressing against his chest. "After all this time, after all the good we've seen, they're turning it into a scandal." At that same hour, Keanu sat quietly in the back pew of the church. He hadn't wanted to come, but something drew him there. Parents and children who once greeted him with smiles now whispered nervously. Some avoided his eyes altogether. He felt the sting, like open wounds. By noon, television vans lined the street outside Hope Fellowship. Reporters shoved microphones toward anyone who entered or left the building. Some parents refused to bring their children to tutoring that day, afraid of what the association might mean for them. Carter stood at the window and watched it unfold, his heart breaking. He had seen fragile hope take root in this community, and now he saw it being ripped away by lies and suspicion. That evening, a meeting was called. The fellowship hall filled with anxious faces. Mrs. Thompson spoke first, her hands trembling. "Pastor, I don't understand. We trusted this man. Was it all just for show?" Carter tried to answer, but before he could, another parent stood up. "If these headlines are true, then everything we've built is tainted. My boy has been part of the computer classes, but now people are saying it was all a front for Hollywood. I can't let him be used like that." The room erupted in murmurs, fear, anger, doubt. Carter raised his hands for quiet. "I know what you've heard. I know what the papers are saying. But I also know what we've seen with our own eyes. Have the children not learned to read? Have parents not learned to cook and sew? Have young men not found purpose in working with their hands? Did any of that change overnight because of an article?" His words calmed some, but not all. One mother shook her head. "Pastor, good things can still be used by bad people. What if he's been playing us all along?" Carter looked toward the back of the room, where Keanu sat silently, his shoulders slumped. For the first time since meeting him, Carter saw doubt in the actor's eyes, not doubt in himself, but in whether he belonged there at all. As the meeting ended, Carter lingered long after everyone else had gone. The weight of leadership pressed on him heavier than ever before. For the first time, he considered whether shutting down the programs might be the only way to protect his congregation from further harm. The next morning, the chaos intensified. News anchors dissected every detail of the leaked documents, flashing Keanu's face alongside phrases like charity scam and Hollywood manipulation. The so-called evidence was nothing more than internal emails and donation records, stripped of context and framed to look suspicious. But truth rarely stood a chance against spectacle. By midweek, the frenzy reached a boiling point. A well-known talk show host declared, "This is nothing more than a vanity project." Keanu Reeves wanted to look like a saint, and Pastor Carter gave him the stage. Her words were repeated across networks, echoed by pundits, and amplified on social media. Carter felt the impact everywhere. Parents who once trusted the church began pulling their children from programs. Attendance at Sunday services dropped by nearly half. The kitchen that had once overflowed with laughter and the smell of cornbread now sat half empty. In the middle of the week, a tense meeting of church leaders was called. Deacon Harris leaned forward, his voice low but heavy. "Pastor, we have to protect our people. If this storm doesn't calm, we'll lose everything. Maybe we should pause the programs. at least until the truth comes out. Mrs. Thompson, who had defended Keanu before, looked torn. I believe in what we've built, Pastor, but the community is scared. They feel tricked. Even if we know it isn't true, perception is powerful. Carter rubbed his temples. He could feel his strength fraying at the edges. He thought of all the children who had blossomed, of all the parents who had found hope. Could he really dismantle it all to shield them from the sting of scandal? Late that night, Keanu knocked gently on Carter's office door. He looked weary, his usually calm face lined with exhaustion. I should go, he said quietly. If I leave, maybe the noise dies down. Maybe they'll trust you again. Carter shook his head. Leaving won't silence them. It'll only confirm their suspicions. They'll say you ran because you were guilty. Keanu sighed and sank into a chair. Elijah, I never wanted the spotlight. I came here for peace, to serve quietly. And now, because of me, your people are hurting. Carter leaned forward. Because of you, children can read. Because of you, families are cooking meals together. Because of you, young men found trades and confidence. Don't ever think your presence was a curse. Keanu looked at him, his eyes dark with conflict. Then what do we do? Carter stared out the window at the fellowship hall, now empty and silent. I don't know, he admitted, but I can't stand by and watch them lose faith. If it means shutting everything down to protect them, maybe that's the price we have to pay. Keanu didn't argue. He only nodded slowly, though his heart ached at the thought. The decision loomed over Carter for the rest of the week. Each phone call from reporters, each sideways glance from a neighbor, each child who failed to show up for tutoring seemed to confirm that the storm might destroy everything. And still, deep in his chest, he wrestled with the question. Would surrender truly protect his people, or would it strip away the very hope they had fought so hard to build? By Friday morning, Elijah Carter knew he could not remain silent any longer. The scandal had dragged on for days, and silence was being interpreted as guilt. Families continued to waver. Programs stood half empty, and reporters circled the church like vultures. Carter prayed through the night, and when dawn broke, he made his decision. He would not fight with anger. He would not argue with words alone. He would lay everything bare. By noon, he had called for a press conference at the fellowship hall. Reporters packed the room, their cameras perched like watchful eyes. The air buzzed with anticipation, ready to seize upon any misstep. Outside, church members gathered nervously, unsure of what their pastor would say. At exactly 2 o'clock, Carter walked to the podium. His shoulders were squared, but his face carried the weight of sleepless nights. To his right stood Denise, her steady presence a quiet anchor. To his left, Keanu stood silently, hands clasped, head slightly bowed. He had refused to abandon Carter, even though his very presence fanned the flames of suspicion. The murmurs in the room grew louder when the cameras found Keanu. This was what they wanted, a spectacle, a celebrity under fire. But Carter's voice cut through the noise, firm and steady. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for coming. For the past week, there have been stories printed and broadcasted about our church, about these programs, and about Mr. Keanu Reeves. They accuse us of fraud, of manipulation, of using hope as a cover for vanity. Today, I will not give you speeches. I will give you proof. He motioned to a stack of boxes beside the podium. Volunteers wheeled them forward and opened them for the cameras. Inside were binders, 7 years' worth of financial records, donation receipts, tax documents, budgets, and audits. Carter lifted one binder, its edges worn from use, and opened it on the podium. These are our records. Every dollar that came in, every dollar that went out. You may take pictures. You may review them. We have nothing to hide. Gasps rippled across the room. This was not the defiant pastor the media expected. This was a man bearing his soul through spreadsheets and signatures. Carter flipped to a page and held it high. This is where the donations went. Tutoring supplies, cooking classes, carpentry tools, groceries for struggling families. This is where the rent was paid, for the community center, the electricity kept on, the computers purchased. You will not find secret accounts. You will not find hidden salaries. You will find the truth that every cent was used to serve this community. For the first time, the cameras hesitated. Reporters looked at one another, uncertain. The script they had written in advance no longer matched the scene before them. Carter continued, his voice gaining strength. This church is not perfect, and neither am I, but let me be clear. We did not build this program on deceit. We built it on sacrifice. Sacrifice from grandmothers who gave their time, from fathers who offered their skills, from young people who chose to lead instead of run away. And yes, we built it with the support of a man who gave not for recognition, but because he believed in what ordinary people could do. All eyes shifted to Keanu, but he remained still, his silence louder than any defense. The room stirred as Carter closed the binder and placed it back on the stack. Reporters raised their hands, voices overlapping, each one eager to poke holes in what they had just witnessed. One reporter stood first, his tone sharp. "Pastor Carter, these binders could be staged. How do we know this isn't just a performance to protect your reputation?" Carter leaned into the microphone. "Because they're not copies. These are the originals. Our accountants, our auditors, our treasurer, all their signatures are here. Call them, verify them, interview anyone in this community, and they will tell you where the money went. I don't ask you to take my word. I ask you to look at the evidence." Another voice cut in, this time from a woman in the back. "If Mr. Reeves really gave all this money, why didn't he go public? Why hide? Wasn't this just another stunt?" Keanu finally lifted his head. His voice was calm but firm. "Because helping people isn't a stunt. I didn't want cameras. I didn't want my name on plaques. I came here to serve, not to pose. If that looks suspicious to you, maybe it says more about the world we live in than it does about me." The words hung in the air. For a moment, the room quieted. Then another reporter pressed forward. "But surely you benefited from the attention. Isn't this about polishing your brand?" Keanu shook his head. "If I wanted attention, I would have announced it years ago. I stayed silent because this was never about me. It was about kids learning to read, about families finding dignity. The spotlight has always belonged to them." Murmurs ran through the crowd, some skeptical, others contemplative. The tension was thick, as if the room itself was deciding whether to believe. Then it happened. From the back of the hall, a young voice called out. A boy stood up, no older than 16. His clothes were simple, his shoes worn, but his eyes shone with conviction. "My name is Marcus," he said, his voice cracking slightly. "I live 3 blocks from this church. 3 years ago, I couldn't read. I used to skip school because I felt stupid. But then this church started the tutoring program. Mr. Reeves came and read books with us. He didn't just sit in the back, he sat on the floor next to me, like I mattered. Now I'm in high school, on the honor roll, and I want to go to college. So if you're asking if this program is real, look at me." The hall fell silent. Cameras swiveled toward Marcus, capturing his trembling hands and his unwavering courage. Reporters who had been sharpening their pens paused, mid-scribble. Carter swallowed hard, his throat tight. He hadn't planned for this. No one had. Yet in that moment, Marcus's testimony was more powerful than any binder, more unshakable than any defense. Marcus raised his chin, tears brimming in his eyes. "This place saved my life. And it wasn't fake. It wasn't for the cameras. It was for us. All of us." The silence deepened. Even the reporters who had come ready to attack found themselves hesitating, because it was hard to argue with the face of a boy who had found hope. Carter glanced at Keanu. For the first time that day, a faint smile tugged at the actor's lips, not for himself, but for the truth spoken by a child who had nothing to gain but everything to share. The silence after Marcus's words stretched long enough for hearts to steady. Reporters who had come ready to dismantle the church found themselves scribbling not accusations but fragments of testimony. Yet before the quiet could settle into closure, another voice rose from the crowd. It was Mrs. Thompson. She stepped forward slowly, her hands shaking from age but her eyes fierce. "I'm 73 years old," she began, addressing the cameras directly. "I used to think my days of being useful were long gone. I cooked for my granddaughter, I cleaned my little apartment, and I waited for the years to pass. Then this program asked me to teach cooking to young mothers. Me, a woman who thought she had nothing left to give. Do you know what that did for me? It gave me back my dignity. I'm not just living out my days, I'm shaping futures." Gasps rippled across the hall. The camera zoomed in, recording the raw emotion etched across her face. Reporters who had been braced for sound bites now listened as though every syllable carried weight. Before she could even sit down, a man from the back rose. He was still wearing his work clothes, the grease stains of the auto shop visible on his shirt. "My name's Henry," he said, his voice gravelly. "For 10 years I was out of work, couldn't provide for my family. I thought I was finished. Then Pastor Carter and these folks started job training here. I learned carpentry. I fixed up houses in this neighborhood. Now I've got steady work. My family eats because of what happened here. If anyone wants to call that a fraud, they can come look my kids in the eye and tell them dinner on the table isn't real." The crowd shifted. What had begun as a defensive press conference was turning into something entirely different. Reporters glanced uneasily at one another, their pens now chronicling transformation instead of scandal. Then a mother stood, her baby perched on her hip. "I was lost when I first came here," she said softly. "My husband left. I didn't have money for daycare. This church welcomed me. They taught me how to cook meals from scratch, how to budget, how to breathe again when I thought my world was ending. This place didn't just give me help, it gave me hope." Her voice cracked. She bounced the baby gently, but her words carried through the silence like thunder. Row after row, more members began to rise. A teenager who had once been caught shoplifting shared how tutoring redirected his path. An older man confessed he had battled alcoholism until the community center gave him accountability and purpose. A group of young girls, shy but determined, spoke about learning to code computers and dreaming of college. Carter stood at the podium, overwhelmed. He hadn't asked for these testimonies, but they poured out like a flood. Each story was another brick laid against the wall of lies that had tried to bury them. The shock was no longer whether Keanu Reeves had given money. The shock was realizing that the true treasure wasn't financial at all. It was the people themselves. Ordinary lives, now extraordinary, in their courage, their growth, their power. The fellowship hall had become something no reporter expected. It was no longer a press event. It was a revival of voices, each testimony stronger than the last, each story building a case that no headline could erase. A young man named Daryl, no older than 19, stood nervously before speaking. "I used to run with the wrong crowd," he admitted. "My friends and we didn't think we had a future. I almost ended up in jail, but Pastor Carter gave me a second chance here. Mr. Reeves showed up one day and sat with me like I mattered. I didn't think people like him even saw kids like me. Now I'm working on getting my GED. I'm alive because someone cared." The reporters scribbled, but slower this time. They weren't writing sound bites, they were capturing something they hadn't planned for: redemption. Next, Marisol, a grandmother from Puerto Rico, raised her hand. Her English was halting, but her determination carried her words. "I was alone when I came to Detroit. I cleaned houses. I didn't know people here. This church gave me family. They let me teach sewing. Now, I help mothers make clothes, save money. They call me teacher. Me, teacher. I never thought I could be that." Her pride drew applause from the congregation, and even some reporters found themselves clapping, though they hadn't intended to. Denise, standing nearby, wiped her eyes. She had been the one who first convinced Carter to try something new. Now, she saw the harvest with her own eyes. A room full of transformed lives, each story undeniable. The testimonies kept coming. A father spoke of being able to buy his first home after completing a job training program. A young girl, barely 12, described how learning to read gave her confidence to dream of becoming a teacher. A recovering addict told how volunteering at the center gave him a reason to stay clean. Every word chipped away at suspicion. Every voice rewrote the narrative. The reporters shifted uncomfortably in their seats. They had come to Detroit expecting to uncover scandal, but instead they were witnessing resurrection. Carter finally raised his hand to pause the flood of stories. "Thank you," he said, his voice trembling. "Thank you for reminding all of us why we started this in the first place." He looked at the reporters directly. "You came here looking for fraud. You came here looking for corruption. What you found is a community. You found mothers teaching, children thriving, men and women rediscovering their dignity. You found the power of people who refuse to be forgotten." The hall erupted in applause, not for Carter, not for Keanu, but for themselves, for the community they had become. One reporter finally stood, his voice quieter than before. "Pastor Carter, I came here skeptical, but after hearing these testimonies, I have to ask, do you realize what's happening here? The real shock isn't the money, it's the people." Carter nodded slowly, tears brimming. "That's exactly it. The miracle isn't generosity from one man. The miracle is what generosity unlocked in all of us. Ordinary people, realizing they already carried extraordinary power. The cameras captured every second, and for the first time, it wasn't scandal filling the lenses, it was hope." The week after the press conference, the air around Detroit began to change. Where suspicion had once hung heavy, now there was quiet conviction. The testimonies of ordinary people had done what documents and speeches could not. They had turned the story inside out. Major news outlets ran follow-up pieces with headlines like "From Scandal to Salvation, Detroit's Community Story," and Keanu Reeves quietly backing grassroots revival. Instead of painting Carter as a fraud, they highlighted the raw humanity that had spilled out from his congregation. For once, the focus wasn't on scandal, but on survival and the beauty of people rising together. Families who had stepped back returned cautiously, then fully. The tutoring program filled again. Chairs scraped across the floor as children pressed close to their books. The cooking classes bustled with laughter and flour-dusted aprons. Even the job training center, once at risk of closing, saw new sign-ups every week. The scandal had not destroyed the work. If anything, it had revealed just how much it mattered. Carter noticed the change most on Sunday mornings. The pews that had sat half-empty during the darkest week were now crowded again. People sang louder, prayed harder, and looked one another in the eye with renewed determination. After service one Sunday, Denise leaned close and whispered, "Do you feel it? It's like the storm washed away the doubt. What's left is stronger." Carter nodded. "I feel it. They aren't just here to watch anymore. They're here to work, to build, to carry this themselves." Beyond Detroit, the ripple spread. Churches in Chicago, Memphis, and even small towns in the South began reaching out. Leaders who had once been skeptical now wanted to learn how Carter's small church had survived not just poverty, but scandal. They weren't asking for money. They were asking for principles. Keanu watched all this quietly, often standing at the back of the fellowship hall or helping sweep after programs. He avoided interviews, refused to comment for headlines, and turned down every request for his personal spotlight. One evening, as the two men locked up the church, Carter sighed. "I worry sometimes that this is getting too big. What if we can't carry it? What if it falls apart under its own weight?" Keanu set down the keys he was holding and looked at him. "Elijah, you're not carrying it. That's the point. You're not building an empire with your name on it. You're nurturing something people can carry themselves. Movements don't need stars. They need people who care. That's what this is becoming." Carter let those words settle in his heart. For so long, he had feared losing control. Now he realized the strength of the work was that it was never meant to be his alone. It belonged to everyone who chose to care. As weeks turned to months, Carter began receiving invitations from pastors he had never met. Some were from large cities, others from rural towns, all echoing the same message. "We heard about Detroit. Teach us how to do it here." One pastor from Memphis described how his neighborhood suffered from gang violence. He wanted to start tutoring and mentorship programs, but didn't know where to begin. Carter didn't send him a manual or a blueprint. Instead, he shared stories how Mrs. Thompson discovered her gift through cooking, how Henry found stability through carpentry, how young Marcus regained his confidence through tutoring. "Start by asking who in your congregation already has gifts," Carter told him. "The programs grow from people, not from plans." Another call came from a small town in Alabama, where a congregation was struggling with unemployment. Carter suggested they start small. Find one skill someone can teach. Build around that. Don't aim to save the world, aim to help your neighbor. Within months, that church had launched a gardening program that provided fresh produce and blessed part-time jobs for dozens of families. Every story Carter heard reminded him that the movement was never about creating copies of Detroit. It was about principles, humility, and empowerment. Each community had its own soil, its own roots. His role was simply to water where he could. In Detroit itself, more leaders began to rise. Young people who had once been students were now becoming teachers. Marcus, still only 16, started volunteering as a peer tutor. Mothers who had attended literacy classes were leading their own groups. Henry, the auto worker who had learned carpentry, began running workshops for unemployed men. What had once required Carter's constant supervision was now running through the strength of the people themselves. One evening, Carter walked through the fellowship hall after a long day. He expected to see the usual bustle of children and parents, but what struck him was that everything was running smoothly without him. Mrs. Thompson was leading a cooking class in one room. Marcus was helping kids with their reading in another. Henry was in the back repairing chairs with a group of men. Carter stood silently, unnoticed, realizing the work no longer depended on his presence. For a pastor who once feared failure at every turn, this realization felt like freedom. Later that night, he shared this with Denise. "It's happening without me," he said, still amazed. "I used to think if I wasn't holding it all together, it would fall apart. But now I see it's holding itself." Denise smiled knowingly. "That's because it was never about you, Elijah. It was always about them. You just gave them space to see what they already had." The news of these changes spread. National newspapers began to cover not the scandal, but the resilience. One headline read, "Detroit's church that refused to die inspires a movement." Another featured Marcus himself, with the caption, "From struggling student to teacher, a neighborhood transformed." Carter realized then that what had survived the storm was not just his church, but an idea stronger than scandal, larger than any one leader. He was not building a tower with his name on it. He was nurturing a garden where others could plant seeds of their own. It started with a letter from Kenya. A pastor named Samuel wrote to Carter, describing a small church in Nairobi that had begun offering computer lessons in the back of their sanctuary. "We heard about Detroit," Samuel wrote, "and we wanted to try. We don't have much, but the young people are hungry to learn." Enclosed with the letter was a photograph. Children seated on wooden benches, typing on keyboards so old the letters were worn away. Their smiles radiated possibility. Carter held the photo in his hands for a long time. It was both humbling and surreal. The work that had once been confined to a corner of Detroit was now leaping oceans. Soon after, an invitation came from Brazil. A pastor in Sao Paulo had heard about the job training initiatives and wanted Carter to speak at a regional gathering of church leaders. Another request arrived from India, where a small group of women had started micro-businesses after learning about Detroit's community kitchens. Each message carried the same note of recognition. "We can do this too." At first, Carter hesitated. "I don't want to leave our people behind," he told Denise one night. "What if traveling abroad distracts us from what's here?" Denise reassured him. Elijah, this isn't about abandoning Detroit. It's about sharing what Detroit has already proven. If others are finding hope because of what started here, isn't that worth carrying forward? Keanu, listening quietly, finally spoke. Hope isn't confined to a zip code. If your people here are strong enough to carry the work, maybe that's the sign it's ready to spread. So Carter and Keanu boarded planes, sometimes together, sometimes separately, crossing borders they had never imagined. In Brazil, Carter walked through favelas, where families lived in tin-roofed shacks, yet gathered eagerly in community halls to discuss job training and youth mentorship. He spoke through a translator, but the hunger in the eyes of his listeners needed no translation. In Nairobi, Samuel introduced Carter to a group of teenagers who had already built simple computer programs despite outdated equipment. "We learned from Detroit," one boy said proudly. "If they can change their neighborhood, why can't we change ours?" Keanu visited programs in Manila, where young mothers were learning to cook nutritious meals from scarce resources. He moved unnoticed in the crowded markets, encouraging volunteers and listening to their stories. He avoided speeches, preferring to sit at low wooden tables beside the women, sharing food and laughter. What struck both Carter and Keanu most was how every place adapted the model. In Africa, it was about technology and literacy. In South America, it was about jobs and safety. In Asia, it was about nutrition and community health. No one was copying Detroit word for word. They were taking the seed and planting it in their own soil, growing something new, something local, something powerful. Each trip left Carter awestruck. On long flights home, he would stare out the window at clouds drifting across continents and whisper to himself, "This is bigger than us now, much bigger." And still, the invitations kept coming. By the second year of international outreach, Carter realized the scale had become undeniable. What began as a handful of letters had grown into hundreds of invitations. Leaders from Ghana, Argentina, Thailand, and beyond reached out, each describing the way their own people had taken Detroit's principles and made them their own. Carter kept journals from his travels, and each page told a story of adaptation. In Ghana, he wrote of Grace, a young woman who had created women's cooperatives in rural villages. She explained how she had once relied on outside charities that collapsed when funding ended. "We don't want handouts," she told Carter. "We want ownership." Her cooperative had tripled in size within a year, teaching women to grow crops, sell goods, and educate their children. In Argentina, Carter visited a small town outside Buenos Aires where former factory workers had started a carpentry school. They proudly showed him tables and chairs they had built, explaining that they were now supplying furniture to local schools. "We are not just surviving," their leader said. "We are creating." Keanu's journals looked different. Where Carter documented statistics and structure, Keanu captured moments. A boy in Manila offering him a bowl of rice. A grandmother in Nairobi taking his hand and thanking him in Swahili he didn't understand but felt in his bones. A classroom in Brazil where students cheered when he walked in, not because he was famous, but because he sat down and asked them to show him what they were learning. Everywhere they went, people emphasized the same truth. They weren't imitating Detroit. They were drawing courage from Detroit. Each program looked different, but the heartbeat was the same: respect, empowerment, and dignity. Word spread beyond churches. Universities invited Carter to lecture on community-driven development. Governments asked for advice on integrating local wisdom into national policies. Nonprofits sought to partner without overshadowing. The momentum reached a turning point when an invitation arrived from Geneva. An international coalition of community organizations was hosting a global summit and wanted Carter to deliver the keynote address. "We've been following your work," the letter read. "It has become a model for more than 30 countries. We believe it's time for the world to gather, not to hear about Detroit, but to witness what local communities are building, everywhere." At first, Carter hesitated again. He wasn't comfortable with stages, lights, and microphones. He was a pastor from Detroit, not a global figure. But Keanu reminded him gently, "You're not going there for yourself. You're going to remind them what this has always been about: people helping people." The convention hall in Geneva was unlike anything Carter had ever seen. Thousands of leaders from every continent filled the space, their clothes reflecting cultures from around the world. Some wore suits, others traditional garments, but all shared a common purpose. Screens projected images of communities thriving: computer labs in Africa, job centers in South America, literacy programs in Asia. When Carter took the stage, he looked out and felt the same nervous weight he had once felt in his tiny Detroit church. Yet when he began to speak, it was not nerves, but gratitude that filled his words. He didn't list numbers or claim credit. Instead, he told the stories: the boy in Nairobi, the women in Ghana, the workers in Argentina. As he spoke, Keanu sat quietly in the front row, his presence steady but unassuming. For Carter, that was the reminder he needed. This wasn't about a single man or a single city. It was about a global family discovering its own strength. The years rolled by like pages in a book, each chapter filled with new growth, new leaders, and new communities rising to their own strength. But for Carter, one story remained closer than all the others. It was the story of Marcus, the boy who once struggled with reading, who had sat shyly in the tutoring program with his head bowed, afraid of being seen as less than others. Carter remembered the night Marcus first picked up a book without prompting. The memory of that moment, his hesitant smile, his whispered words as he sounded out sentences, was etched into his heart. It had been one of the first signs that what they were building in Detroit mattered. Now, years later, Marcus was no longer a boy. He was a man in his 20s, standing tall, confident, and carrying himself with the quiet authority of someone who had found his calling. Carter received the news through Denise first. She burst into his office one afternoon, eyes gleaming with pride. "Elijah, you won't believe this," she said, holding out a flyer. Across the top were bold words: "Grand Opening, Detroit Youth Empowerment Center," and beneath it, a photograph of Marcus, now with a full smile, his arm around a group of teenagers. Carter's eyes filled as he read the flyer. "He did it," he whispered. "He actually did it." The center was only a few blocks from Hope Church, but the building had been transformed. Where once there was a crumbling warehouse, now stood a brightly painted facility with classrooms, a computer lab, and a recreation hall. Marcus had raised funds, rallied volunteers, and pieced together support from businesses and local families. It was not flashy. It was not backed by big names, but it was alive with purpose. On opening day, Carter and Keanu stood quietly in the crowd, not drawing attention to themselves. They watched as Marcus took the microphone, speaking with a confidence that would have been unthinkable in his youth. "I was once a kid who didn't believe in myself," Marcus told the crowd. "I thought failure was written into my story, but this church, this community, and yes, Mr. Reeves, showed me something different. They showed me that hope isn't a gift you receive once. It's something you learn to pass on." The applause was thunderous, but Marcus didn't bask in it. He pointed to the teenagers standing beside him. "This isn't about me, it's about them. It's about making sure no kid in this city ever feels forgotten again." After the ceremony, Marcus found Carter and Keanu standing to the side. He embraced Carter tightly, tears brimming in his eyes. "Pastor, I wanted to quit so many times, but I kept remembering how you never gave up on me. That belief, it changed everything." Carter's voice shook as he replied, "Marcus, the miracle isn't what we gave you, it's what you chose to do with it. You've multiplied hope in ways I could never have imagined." Then Marcus turned to Keanu, his expression full of gratitude. "And you, everyone talks about your fame, but what I'll never forget is you sitting on the floor with me, reading books when no one else had time. You showed me that kindness is more powerful than any spotlight. Thank you." Keanu's response was simple, but his eyes carried weight. "I didn't do anything special, Marcus. You were always capable. I just wanted to make sure you saw it for yourself." In the months that followed, Carter made a point to visit Marcus's center often. Each time, he found himself quietly astonished by what he saw. The once timid boy who could barely raise his eyes in class was now guiding groups of teenagers with steady hands and a steady voice. One evening, Carter slipped into the back of the main hall during a tutoring session. Marcus was at the front, holding up a book while 3 students followed along, their lips moving as they read aloud. He corrected gently, encouraged often, and celebrated small victories with genuine joy. When one girl stumbled on a difficult word, Marcus knelt beside her, whispering encouragement until she grinned and finished the sentence. The other students clapped, and Carter felt his chest tighten. This was multiplication in motion. Later that night, Marcus joined him outside, leaning against the wall under the glow of a streetlight. "It feels strange sometimes," Marcus admitted. "I keep wondering if I'm really strong enough to lead. But then I remember you both believed in me when I didn't believe in myself. And if you could see something in me then, maybe I can see it now." Carter put a hand on his shoulder. "Marcus, leadership isn't about never doubting. It's about remembering why you started. You've carried that reason faithfully." Keanu visited too, but never as a guest of honor. He slipped in quietly, sitting at computers with the kids, asking about their projects, and eating pizza with them in the cafeteria. Marcus often teased him, "You could be anywhere in the world, but you're here fixing a jammed printer." Keanu only smiled. "That's the point. It's the small things that matter." As the center grew, so did its impact. Local newspapers ran stories about how Marcus had turned his own struggles into strength for others. Schools began referring students who needed extra support. Families who once felt isolated now had a place to gather. And little by little, the surrounding neighborhood shifted. Graffiti-covered walls were painted with murals of hope. Empty lots became gardens, and the sound of laughter spilled into the streets after school hours. Carter often walked home from the center with tears stinging his eyes. He had once feared that numbers would measure their success. How many programs? How many headlines? How many grants? But watching Marcus, he saw the truth. The real miracle wasn't in numbers, it was in multiplication. One child lifted up had become dozens. Dozens would soon become hundreds. And someday, hundreds would become thousands. On the anniversary of the center's opening, Marcus hosted a gathering. Parents, students, and volunteers filled the hall, and at the front sat Carter and Keanu, honored but quiet. Marcus spoke from his heart. "When I was a boy, I thought my story was over before it began. But two men showed me that hope isn't something you keep, it's something you give away. Tonight, I don't just want to thank them. I want to promise them that I'll spend my life passing that gift forward." The room erupted in applause, but Carter hardly heard it. His eyes blurred with tears as he looked at Keanu, who gave a small nod as if to say, "This is what we dreamed of." And in that moment, Carter understood. Hope had come full circle. The evening was quiet when Pastor Elijah Carter stepped out onto the front steps of Hope Church. The sun was sinking low, casting an amber glow across the neighborhood. Children played in the park across the street. Families sat on porches, voices mingling in laughter and conversation. It was the kind of peace Carter had once only dreamed of when the pews were nearly empty and the roof leaked with every storm. Keanu Reeves joined him, carrying 2 cups of coffee. He handed one to Carter without saying a word, and together they sat on the stone steps, watching the streetlights flicker on. They had walked through seasons of doubt, scandal, and hard choices, yet here they were, side by side, witnessing a community that had once been written off as broken, now thriving with life. Carter took a slow sip before speaking. "You know, Keanu, sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I hadn't turned you away that first Sunday. Maybe things would have gone differently. Maybe we wouldn't be here now." Keanu shook his head gently. "I think we would be, Elijah. Because this was never about me. It was about you. About them. About what happens when people realize they can carry each other," Carter thought. About Marcus. About the mothers who had started cooking programs. About the boys who had turned from gangs to classrooms. He thought about the letters from Ghana, Brazil, and India, about leaders across the globe building their own solutions. He thought about the laughter inside the new youth center and the hope in the eyes of families who no longer feared the future. "The real miracle," Carter said slowly, "wasn't that a celebrity showed up at our door. It was that one community learned how to help itself, and in doing so, it lit a fire that spread farther than we could have ever imagined." Keanu's eyes softened. Hope multiplies. That's the lesson. It doesn't matter where it starts. What matters is that it keeps going. They sat in silence for a while, listening to the city breathe. For Carter, silence no longer carried the weight of despair. It carried the sound of possibility. Every laugh, every footstep, every voice was proof that what began in a small church with failing pews had grown into something that no scandal, no doubt, no pride could undo. Carter stood and looked at the church behind them. Its walls were painted, its windows repaired, but those were not the true signs of its strength. The true sign was in the people walking in and out every day, carrying hope like a torch into homes, schools, and workplaces. Turning back to Keanu, he asked, "Do you think we've done enough?" Keanu didn't hesitate. It was never about doing enough. It was about doing our part. The rest belongs to them. And from the looks of it, they're doing just fine. Carter smiled. The kind of smile that came not from relief, but from peace. He knew Keanu was right. Their role had never been to carry the whole burden. Their role was to start, to spark, to trust that others would pick it up and run farther than they ever could. The street below grew darker as night fell, but the neighborhood glowed with a different kind of light. It was the light of Gar, resilience, of dignity, of ordinary people discovering their own strength. And Carter knew, deep in his bones, that this was the legacy worth leaving. The next morning, Carter stood once more at the pulpit of Hope Church. The sanctuary was filled to the brim. Neighbors, volunteers, children now grown into young adults, even visitors from out of town who had heard about the programs. The stained glass windows shimmered with sunlight, casting soft colors across the faces of people who had walked this long journey with him. He looked out over the congregation, and for a moment, his throat tightened. He remembered when only a handful of people filled these pews, when despair seemed stronger than faith. Now the room pulsed with life, laughter, and purpose. "My friends," Carter began, his voice steady but heavy with emotion, "I've been thinking about the road we've walked together. It hasn't been easy. There were times when pride almost destroyed us, times when scandal nearly broke us, and times when we wondered if hope could really last. But today, standing here, I see the proof in each of you. The miracle wasn't in the numbers. It wasn't in the headlines. It was in what happened inside this room and beyond these walls." He gestured to the rows of young people at the front. "Some of you were children when we began. You sat on these floors with Keanu, reading books, learning to dream again. Now you're teaching others. That's the miracle. Not addition, but multiplication." Hope passed from one to another, until it became too powerful to stop. The room grew quiet, every ear tuned to his words. "I want you to remember something important," Carter continued. "The miracle was never that a well-known actor showed up in our church. The miracle was that this community discovered it already had the power to heal itself. What Keanu gave us was not charity. It was a reminder that help isn't weakness, that dignity is not lost when you accept support. What matters is what you do with it once it's in your hands." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. "And you, my friends, have shown the world what's possible when ordinary people decide to believe in themselves and each other." From his seat near the front, Keanu lowered his head humbly. He had heard many speeches in his life, but this one struck deep. It was never about him, and Carter's words made that truth clear. Carter closed with a final reflection, his voice rising with conviction. Every person here matters. Every voice matters. Every act of kindness, no matter how small, multiplies into something greater. Never believe the lie that you are powerless. Never think that one life cannot change 100 more. You have proven the opposite. You have proven that hope is stronger than despair, and love is stronger than fear. He stepped down from the pulpit and looked directly at the audience. Not just those in the pews, but those beyond the camera who would watch and listen across the world. And now, I leave you with this question. Would you accept help if it meant saving your community? Tell us in the comments below, because your answer might be the first step in a miracle that begins right where you are. The congregation erupted into applause, but Carter's heart was calm. He knew this was not an ending. It was a continuation. Hope would go on multiplying, one person, one family, one community at a time.